Okay, Nick says he's logging on. I can Slack Jason as well.
There's Jason.
Oh, good. Excellent. Hi, Jason.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, no problem.
And we're getting a good turnout now. Looks good. Here we are. All right, we're all here. So Tim, I'd say we can go ahead anytime.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and admit all and we'll get
Do you
started.
want, so let's take 1 minute. I think for panelists, we'll basically all be, I think, sort of unmuted. So it's not too much, you know, breaking up the conversation. And I think that'll work out all right if we all sort of are on at the same time. Sound okay?
I think so.
Good.
Yeah. Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Here we go.
All right, here we go. And Tim, you'll let me know when you think everyone's
Okay.
in,
Actually, I'm going
right?
to turn the waiting room off when everyone's in and I'll let you know for sure.
And my internet connection is unstable.
Uh-oh.
Always the perfect timing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is this time of day, I must say.
Oh, true. I decided actually I had to go to like hardwire my house because so I just dragged an incredibly long wire now to this place because I was like, Wi-Fi is just not doing it.
I think you've got the right idea for sure.
Great.
I went
Carol.
wired too, but sorry, go ahead.
So Carol, the meeting is, the waiting room's been taken away and it looks like everybody
I see 2 people still in the waiting room.
sort of strange. So
Do you want me to admit them?
I got them.
Okay, we'll wait for them and then we'll go ahead and start.
Interesting.
It's all so interesting. All right, I'm going to start. I'm assuming we'll get that last person in here.
Yes, we'll get them on.
Thank you all for coming. I want to welcome you to what I understand is the last scheduled Welcome Week event. So I'm thrilled that you're joining us for this, what I think is a very exciting way to close up this week of the new academic year. I'm Carol Palmer. I'm a professor here at the Information School and the Associate Dean for Research. And I'm going to serve as the moderator today. And then we have our panelists who are also up here on, hopefully looking you in the eye through Zoom. There they are. I want to tell you a little bit about how the Research Blitz came about. It really started when our new dean came on board a few years ago, and he was experiencing our orientation events and felt like we were really missing this focus on research. And it was something when he had been at Carnegie Mellon University that they used to do there. And so we went ahead and adopted the tradition here, and it's really been quite successful. We've had packed the room years in a row, and now I'm seeing we're also getting a very good turnout today. So great to see all this interest in research. I think maybe the idea of the Blitz is maybe a little more appropriate when we had a room full of participants and we lined up often dozens of faculty members to give you these very quick lightning talks. But rather than do that in the online mode, we decided to go ahead and do more of a panel approach this year. But you can, if you go back to the Welcome Week website, you'll see that there are 12 talks, of these lightning talk nature. linked up there. Several of our panelists also have a lightning talk there. So I do invite you to go and enjoy those as well. But today we have this smaller group of what I would call some of our very active and passionate researchers. And what we're going to do is focus on a series of questions that are common questions that we get from students about research. And so I'll give just some introductory remarks, and then we'll move on to those questions. And then after that, after we go through that series of questions, we'll open it up for a Q&A session. And so what I'll say is, those of you who are listening, you can go ahead and type your questions into the chat box really at any time, but as we go. But you also might, hold them till the end, so you get, your most important question in the chat box. But better yet, I'm hoping some of you will, when we move to the question and answer, actually use the raise hand feature. We'll call you, and you, the person you'd like to engage with.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Carol. I'm sorry. The chat is currently disabled. We were going to open it during.
That's fine. Then let's hold the questions.
Okay.
That's great. So hold on to your questions and we'll take them. That'll probably work better because then they won't scroll off the screen.
Thank you.
So yeah, I appreciate that. So I wanted to say first just a few words about, I get asked all the time by students, what is research? And there's so many definitions out there. I don't want to really belabor this, but what you'll often see in a very formal definition is something like systematic inquiry that contributes to knowledge or generalizable knowledge. It talks about often that researchers observe and they test and they measure, they analyze, they interpret. One of the definitions I really like that's very simple is that research is formalized curiosity. But I also often say that research is how we know what we know. And so it's how we evolve and confirm what we know over time and how we grow our knowledge. And so in a school like ours, we have a fascinating array of fields of study that our researchers participate in. But research is also very central to what we do in the Information School and at the University of Washington more generally, which is a Research One university, which means we function at that very highest level of engagement in research. And then in the iSchool, we pride ourselves, of course, of being one of the leading iSchools. And so much of that reputation of being a leading iSchool also pivots on this idea of the research that we contribute to the fields that we're active in. So I wanted to just tell you about the areas of research that we specialize in the school. We have 9 of them that we've identified. There's some overlap there and some bleeding around the edges, but in alphabetical order, they are data science, digital youth, health and well-being, human-computer interaction, indigenous knowledge, information and society, learning sciences, library and information science, and socio-technical information systems. And many of us see ourselves in more than one of those research areas. So what we're going to do now is we'll move to the panel, and I'm going to ask each of you on the panel to please sort of talk about your area, give us some insight into the kinds of projects that you're working on, especially those projects that you might be interested in recruiting students to, but also if you could also comment on what drew you to a research career, because I think many of the people out in the audience are probably weighing whether or not research is something for them. So I'm going to give each of the panelists about 5 minutes to introduce themselves and comment on that. And we'll stay in the alphabetical order just so I can keep things straight. And then after they do their introductions, we'll start on the questions. So we'll start with Bill introducing himself, his area projects, and why this kind of career?
So my name is Bill Howe. I'm an associate professor at the iSchool. So thanks, Carol, for an introduction. You were causing me to reflect on some of the things I was going to say based on what you had said. You mentioned kind of how we know what we know. So I'll come back to that in a second. I thought that was a nice point. So I'm an associate professor here. My PhD is in computer science, and I took sort of a circuitous route into this space. I had been after undergrad, I had did some consulting with big firms and small firms and so forth, and I decided I want to go back to grad school because all the questions sort of seemed to be sort of more that I was interested in were kind of more fundamental than the things we were doing out there. But I always kind of kept this itch to make sure that we were doing something kind of productive. My former advisor used to say, if you have, the difference between 0 applications and 1 application is infinite. And so try to always make sure that there's one key problem that's driving the research, as opposed to being sort of purely abstract and purely methodological. However, in computer science, we do spend a lot of time on methods, and that's something that's been of interest to me, and something I keep here at the iSchool. So what we've been working on in the past, I spent a lot of time working with scientists, and I've interacted with Carol in that context a lot. So this was, as the needs of scientists became more data intensive, there were gaps that we could fill with technology and with approaches. So, it used to be kind of 10 lines on a spreadsheet, and then eventually working with billions of records. The entire kind of system of how we train scientists in, say, biology or forestry or oceanography needed to change. The kinds of tools they were using needed to change. The kinds of software they were using needed to change. And we kind of realized that the stuff that we had built for, we collectively had built for industry was not really getting the job done in these labs. And so that motivated me for a while. But in some sense, the example, the motivation for doing that kind of work was very clear when you're talking to other scientists, but it was occasionally sometimes less clear when you're talking to the general public. And I got interested in doing more work in the public sector for that reason. And so we sort of saw some of the same problems we saw in science, we saw in when you go work in the city government. There's a exploding need to sort of work with large data sets and try to get insight out of large data sets. And yet they had some of the same constraints on maybe between funding and between tools and between complex data sets that came from all over the place that you don't know much about. Some of these same problems that we saw in science, we saw there. So we tried to apply some of those tools there. And then maybe a couple 3 years ago, the observation has been made by us and many other people that, boy, generation 1 of this data science stuff was really about kind of a adolescent techno-optimism of what can we do with all these crazy tools, with all these crazy data sets. And we had a bit of a reckoning where, boy, maybe what we can do is not the right question, but it's more about what we should do. And so not only does that imply bringing more people to the table and really kind of being thoughtful about what kinds of projects we and others might take on, but it also it implies some technical problems. So if you want to, train a model to make predictions, you want to make sure those predictions aren't sort of just reflecting the same kind of biases and discriminatory signals that we have in the data sets which they're trained on. So you can end up kind of doing more harm than good if you just sort of roll this stuff out blindly. But you might be able to fix it if you play your cards right. And so we've been studying those kinds of methods, how to deliver that in general and also in kind of specific areas in the city sector. So maybe I'll stop there. That brings us to current date, and now we're trying to pull data together from large open data repositories and use them to make predictions without kind of screwing up the world in the process.
Great, thanks, Bill. Let's go move on to Amy.
Sure, thanks, Bill. Thanks, Carol. Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Coe. I'm a professor in the Information School, and I am also the Informatics Program Chair, which means I oversee the curriculum and admissions and other aspects of the undergraduate degree. I think if you choose the labels that Carol mentioned, then you would call me somebody that does HCI research. I also do software engineering research and think a lot about youth and learning, but also computer science education. So there's a lot of different things that I do. And to really make that much simpler, really all I'm interested in is programming. I'm interested in how people do it, how they learn to do it, who learns to do it, how they do it professionally, how they do it in teams, what's hard about it, what's fun about it, what's exciting and powerful about it, what's terrible and destructive about it, kind of all of those different aspects of programming. And so when Bill talks about data science, for example, there's pieces of that I find really fascinating, like when people are doing data science and they're using code to try to answer questions or to process large data sets, what's going on in their minds? How are they thinking about that? And how do they reconcile some of those questions of ethics and justice at the same time as trying to decide which API call to make? So I'm really interested in how those two play with each other and cause tension with each other. I'll also kind of bridge my story about how I got into research with Carol's questions about what is research. My favorite definitions of research come from just their Latin etymological roots. And so the definition I found is to wander hither and thither. Also to go in circles. I think a lot of this just comes from the observation that some people in the world just find great joy in looking really closely at things and doing that for a really long time because they're never quite satisfied with their understanding of something. And I think that that characterizes a lot of what we do, certainly what I do. I've been looking at programming very closely for 20 years. And so how did I get into research doing that? Well, I was always curious about programming. I programmed a lot. And when I was a freshman in college, much like many of you on this call, there was a bright pink flyer on the wall that one of the professors had posted for a summer research position. I had a job that was installing Wi-Fi in the dorms for $11 an hour, and this summer research position was $12 an hour. And so I decided $1 more sounds much better than what I was getting. And so I decided to go and interview for it. And I had what it turned out to just be one of the best research mentors on campus. And within 15 minutes, she'd said, imagine a job where you get to follow your curiosities and tell people what you discover and all the other interesting things that people discover, and they pay you to do that, right? That's how she characterized her job as a professor. And that sounded to me like the best job in the world. And so I worked in her lab and did research for 3 years and went off to grad school and continued on. And so I found that path. I was really lucky to find that path early on and have a great mentor to guide me through it. Now, I think that if you think about the structure of my work in my lab, I have 5 or 6 PhD students at any given time, a couple of undergraduates helping out in the lab. We do a lot of different projects. Anything from inventing new ways of explaining hard concepts in computer science, like learning a new programming language or even learning a second one, all the way to more theoretical things, like when somebody is reasoning about programming, what's going on in their mind and what makes that hard, and how does that have implications for things like debugging tools, for example. So we do a lot of things that are both psychologically theoretical, but also technically theoretical. I'll go ahead and leave it at that.
Nice. Thanks, Amy. Okay, Nick Weber, you're next.
Hi, everybody. I really like Amy's description of research is going in circles. That's oftentimes how it feels. But I'm an assistant professor here at the Information School. And, I also note there's a bunch of people that are really, really talented researchers that you're probably not going to hear from in the panel, but I hope will jump in and answer some questions. Coco, Jason, Chris, Hala, Michelle all have incredible resumes that can offer probably slightly more insight than all of us are going to. But I'll tell you a little bit about me. I did my PhD in information science at the University of Illinois. And I got started working on research as a graduate student by doing probably what lots of us are going to recommend that you all do. I just emailed someone. And I told her that I really liked the research design that she came up with to try to answer a set of questions. And importantly, what I did and what I would encourage all of you to do is I told her how I wanted to build on that work. And I had a specific idea, and to my great surprise, she said, okay, if you want to do it, I'll help you figure out how to do it. And so after I did that, and we finally got to some answers in a publishable paper, I then actually knocked on Carol's door and I said, how do I keep doing this? And she helped me figure that out over time. So that's how I ended up where I am now as an assistant professor here at the University of Washington. I work on problems that are broadly defined or broadly kind of situated in the use and access to public information. So in terms of how the iSchool tends to think about the breakdown of, research areas, I do research in library and information science and socio-technical systems. I'll tell you about a couple of projects that my research group has going on and make a plug for you to join us in at least one of those. So one of the things that we've been really interested in as a group over the last 2 or 3 years is the way in which technologies serve city councils and local governments. And so we built this system which did what seems like a very basic thing, which is take a set of audio files and create transcripts from those that people can read and search for to understand what city council members talk about when they get together at a city council meeting. It turns out, though, that city councils all over the USA rarely ever do this, right? They rarely ever make accessible transcripts that people can search and that people that have maybe audio disabilities can access and have a sort of understanding of what their elected officials do. So we built this system, right, which not only creates the transcripts, but then we tie those transcripts to votes that are taken by city councils. And we try to make those publicly available for anybody to access. What we're working on right now, and what I'll put a plug in for if you're interested in joining our team, is around elections. So lots of people, one of the things that we've discovered that are publicly declaring they're running for office at a local government level, put out websites which talk about their platforms that don't have any accessibility design built into them. As such, you can't really be an informed voter if you don't know what a person running for public office claims to be running for. So we have a set of APIs that we built that hooks into and makes use of these websites, and we'd love your help trying to figure out and sort out what the accessibility looks like for people that are running for office at the local level. I'll stop there. There's lots more that we could talk about, but looking forward to hearing from other people too.
Thank you, Nick. Okay, Jason, you're the wrap up.
Okay, so hi, I'm Jason Yip. I'm an assistant professor of digital youth at the iSchool. I also have an appointment as an adjunct affiliate at Human Centered Design and Engineering. I guess my background with research starts in child-computer interaction, learning sciences and information and library sciences. So I kind of do like a mixture of the three things together. I would say my story about how I got into research, like when I was in high school, like I kind of got lucky, and I live in the Washington, D.C. area back then. So I lived near the National Institutes of Health, and I somehow ended up in an immunology lab. I think I saw this $500 competition. I was like, they're gonna pay me $500 to work 3 months. That's so much money. What am I gonna do, right? And it turns out I was like, I had done work in immunology, and I was like studying about something called interferon gamma, and so it seemed pretty cool. I was like, all right, I'm in this sort of wet lab, but I didn't really imagine myself wanting to stay on a lab bench for 24 hours a day. Culturing cells, and I really enjoyed it though. So I ended up in college in my undergrad days thinking I would be pre-med, and then realized like that's not what I wanted to do. So I ended up being a school teacher, and I just really loved teaching. I was a high school teacher for 6 years. But in my time as a high school teacher, I became very frustrated with design. I didn't like the way curriculum was designed. I didn't like the way technologies was designed. I didn't like the way people were implementing design. So you could say that I got into research, purely out of revenge, but like not necessarily to get back at people. No, I did it as a way to just really think about how to improve and how to think, because for a long time, I just, with my background as a teacher, I don't think people were very much listening to me at all. So I thought then I need to really study this. I need to understand like learning, how it happens. So I went to the University of Maryland and got my PhD in science ed, which is a strange PhD to get HCI. But when I was there, I spent a lot of time in child-computer interaction, studying about children and how they use technologies. And I ended up working at Sesame Workshop for a bit, researching on families. And so today, after all that very long, windy path, I ended up as a professor that studies families and collaboration and technologies. So really, what does the family unit look like, and why is it important? I think one of the big questions like we're looking at now, even in COVID, is technology use in families. Like it exploded like in March, and I haven't been stopped with trying to answer that question, right? And so families are like now more than ever involved in technology and learning. And so one of the ways we do a lot of our work is we build technologies. So I do a lot of building and creating new designs. We've done a lot of designs of programming tools for English language learners. We've done work on designing social media and science. We do a lot, and doing that design, we do a lot of co-design work. So I work a lot with children. If you pre-COVID, you would have heard children screaming and yelling at Bloedel Hall. I think Amy has heard them. So they are children that come after school twice a week. We co-design with them on technologies for families. So I study that process. I study that a lot in library. So that's kind of where my library hat kind of comes in. Like We've been doing like a lot of co-design with the Seattle Public Library and their digital youth and trying to build out the activities. And finally, we investigate a lot. So a lot of my work studies now youth invisible work, like what is the kind of work that children do for their families when people don't know about it, particularly the kinds of information work. Like, for example, children are now searching for information on COVID, right? They have to search for their families. They have to be able to translate that information. They're doing things like finding health insurance and like finding like different kinds of education programs for themselves so that they can help their families. And so it's kind of a strange thing when an 11-year-old is now tasked with being the information head of their family. Like, that's a very strange thing, but it's a very real thing. It's a very important thing that we study. So we also study voice technologies and Alexa. How do these things play in our families? So to sort of end, a lot of my work, it's pretty interdisciplinary. I always tell students that if they want to, they're really interested, the most important thing for me is not the research side, actually. It's actually the background in children. I think for me, that's actually really important. It's because I can actually teach research. I think and that might be for a lot of things. It might actually be the background you have in the thing. And then a lot of us end up teaching and helping you all learn how to do research. So I'll kind of end it at that.
Great. Thanks, Jason. And we'll get back to the backgrounds in one of the questions. So I'm glad you led into that. I also wanted to just mention, after hearing all of you, just sort of reflect on the fact of how much research is driven by the problems we care about. And we're really driven by that. And so as someone who sees the whole enterprise of research in the school, it was been really fascinating with the pandemic to see how much research is actually accelerated, even though we have to do it differently and we have a lot of constraints that we didn't have before. People are even more passionate or have more nuances or more different aspects or angles to the problems they're studying. And it's gotten everybody even more energized in a way, and it's just that much more urgent, that we solve problems. So I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, so the first question I have in the common questions from students, I think we've touched on it a little bit, but I'm hoping you can help draw out a little more and help our listeners understand more what the different types of research are. So we hear about, qualitative and quantitative, like it's sort of this versus each other, but there's also experimental research, and we heard about co-design, but there's research and development, R&D, there's evaluation. There's also this idea of basic and applied research. So I'm hoping you guys can sort of jump in and try to highlight and contrast some of the, maybe how your approaches are different from each other, or why a particular approach is particularly suited to a particular problem. But this whole idea of different types of research. And again, this is a great school to interrogate this question because we have such diversity. So now it's a free-for-all. You guys get to jump. No more alphabetical.
This is a big topic.
And we only have a few minutes for it. So
yeah.
2 minutes to wrap up all of the research methods, like my entire Info 300 course in 2 minutes. Gotcha.
Maybe I'll jump in too with just my program chair hat and just say, like, there are so many different ways of knowing whatever conception you have about sort of what ways exist. It probably is missing 80–90% of them too. And I think that each of us has like a toolbox that we have of ones that we draw upon, but it's always a very limited one with respect to the broader set of people that do it. So I started off doing a lot of experiments with quantitative measurements, and then I moved on to qualitative work where there's a lot of interpretation that happens. And I even write argumentation like philosophers do, just pretending to be a philosopher for lots of different things where we're talking about theory too. So even one researcher can do many of those different kinds of things.
I'll put on my Info 300 research methods professor hat a little bit and also say I get this question that like it's kind of it's a little bit of a different way of asking Carol's question, which is I get a lot of students that ask me, so what's the best research method? And I'm like, and I always say, well, like for what? They're like, no, the best. Just teach me the best one. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're asking, because that question totally depends on the context and the kinds of questions. So if you're asking questions about like, large data sets, then you're going to have to know research methods and perspectives that look at that. If you're really interested in people's experiences, that's a completely different story. So one person's experimental design will work in one context, but it won't work in another. So I think about research methods and perspectives as, for me, like, what's the question asking? And then when I think about the question and then another question I sort of get is, what's the best research perspective? Like scientist, experimentalist, critical theory. I'm like, I don't know. Like, it again kind of depends on your worldview and perspective and everything. So I think a lot of research methods draws upon people's backgrounds, their situations. If I know I'm kind of like, so for me, a lot of my work is qualitative, but I also respect quantitative. I do a lot of research with people who build models, and I'm like, yeah, I can respect that. I sort of see that. I tend to be very pragmatic, but I like theory. I like to see big theories go out and understand like a way to explain the world or model the world in that sense. I do a lot of field studies. I go into the homes, but I totally respect lab studies that like focus in on like very specific causality in that sense. So all that to say is it's like, it kind of depends on the question I want to answer. If I want to answer one about very large things, I'm going to need large perspectives. And if I want to do something that's much more race and justice focused, I might want to switch. I tend to switch my perspectives frequently. Some people don't. Some people are like, no, that's wrong. That's not the way to do it. I say no to them too. So, we can say no to each other in research too as well. So there's no right or wrong answer, at least for me, but that's up to debate.
I mean, I'll add a little bit. I think of at the root of all this is there's this question of epistemology, right? How do you know what you know? And Carol alluded to that in the beginning, and I've been thinking a lot about that lately, given the context where there's a large set of people out there that I don't understand their epistemology, and I'd very much like to. But so in some sense, the methods are, at the end of the day, somebody's got to believe what you got to convince yourself, and then you got to go convince other people. And as Jason was saying, there's a lot of different ways to do that. And sometimes you might say, well, this sounds like it's right because we've talked to a lot of people and there seems to be a pattern emerging when we talk to all these people. But then you might say, well, does that pattern really scale up to lots of people? And so you might switch methods to sort of go after some large data set and try to see if they agree. And whenever you get two different avenues of research that kind of agree with each other, you're a little bit more convinced that you're on the right track. But at the end of the day, we don't really know. We're just constructing some argument either in a paper or in a talk or just to each other in the hallway. You're trying to figure out. You're trying to assemble all the evidence and say what sort of conclusions this support. So there's not there certainly isn't only one method. And in fact, again, I'd say that papers and even sometimes entire subfields that tend to over rely on one method, they're more at risk of getting the wrong answer because they didn't sort of check themselves by using a different method. So I too, having come to the iSchool, having been more on the quantitative side where we tend to really value kind of experiments and empirical information and maybe some proofs or something. We might have some mathematical proofs as a way of building evidence. Did anyone actually go out and talk to the people that were using this tool? And if they didn't, then I kind of view that paper more dimly than I would if they hadn't. And I think I think there's some other people in computer science that are adapting to this way of thinking. But I think the iSchool delivers that research method agnosticism quite effectively, and I think that's the right way to do it.
Okay, you want to add anything, Nick, before we move on? Types of research? All right. Okay. So next question is, and this is where you really get to, sway some minds perhaps. Why should students get involved in research?
I
mean, I like Amy's answer, right? It pays a little better than the.
You get $2 more.
$1 more per hour. Yeah, depending on the discipline that you're in, that's very much not true. I like to say that it just goes down to some of those foundations too, right? What does PhD mean? Right? It means love of knowledge. And so there's kind of a foundational thing there where curiosity is the driving thing. When I really ask myself, do I want to go to industry? Do I want to go get a PhD and do research? it was really that core question, like, can I see myself setting aside my curiosity and executing on something and getting more joy out of that, or am I going to get more joy out of following my curiosity? And that's what took me down this path. I will say that that's not the only reason to do research. There's so many other motivations that people have, but it is one that doesn't leave room for a lot of other options if you're a deeply curious person.
Oh, Nick, you're muted.
Nick, we can't hear you, even though you are.
I'll give, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give maybe an unconventional answer. I think it's a great way to compare your ideas within a community of like-minded people. And one of the things that I really enjoy about research is, unfortunately, going to conferences is all online now. But when you write up your findings, right, when you claim to think that you know something, you check them against your peers, and your peers oftentimes, if they're responsible, help you reformulate and craft and be clear about the ideas and the findings that you have. And that's an incredibly rewarding thing to get to do. It's fun to get to do, to try out and get your own ideas tested and vetted, but it's fun to help other people improve their ideas. And research is one of the ways in which we get to do that, both by publishing and presenting the things that we think that we know. So I think that's a very maybe tangential motivation for getting involved with research. But if you like that kind of test of yourself, I think this is a great avenue for it.
Yeah, and that's part of the rigor of research, right? You have to, your ideas have to stand up in a community of really smart people.
I think for me that it kind of boils down to this one question I always get from like rideshare drivers. Like whenever I go to like the University of Washington, they ask me like, oh, where are you going? I'm like, oh, I'm going to University of Washington. They ask like, well, what do you do there? Like, oh, I'm a professor. And they ask, oh, what do you teach? Right? It's the very first question. And so, I think for a lot of undergrads, it's like, what are we teaching you? Right? Like, where does it come from? How do you know that Bill is the preeminent scholar in big data and cities, right? How do you know that Amy should know about computer programming and youth, right? Like, how did we know that, right? Because it's not like there's a textbook out there that I study for. Like when I was a chemistry teacher, I would study the textbook first and then like spit it all out back to my students. At this point now, it's like, wait, who is coming up with this textbook? Who is saying this? Who is saying what? And so for me, that like to go to college at an R1 and not realize like, wait a second, all this stuff comes from somewhere. Where did it come from, right? Like cyber, like the most, like the bleeding edge of cybersecurity, the bleeding edge of big data and all the kind of stuff, or library science, it had to come from somewhere, right? And that, a lot of that comes from our own research. So, so part of the reason why I would say to do it is that like I think, like, I'm sorry, there are no parties anymore. There are none, but you can get involved in research, right? It's just as fun as a party. Because like there's a lot of relationship building. There's a lot of things that you do that's collaborative. There's a lot of things that I think in the college experience, graduate or undergrad, that's surprisingly missing, that I don't ever see people cover. Like I've always kind of been like, man, I can't wait till they do an office version of my life where I could just talk to a documentary person and just sort of say, this is what I think, I think the reason that I think that research is important is also to really ask, like, why are we having these information wars right now on television? Right? Like we go back to even the most pragmatic question, why is one group of people saying science doesn't work while another group of people says science does work, right? Why are we disagreeing? Like, and that all boils down to like what research is, what knowledge is, what do you count as knowledge? Like is a story from my grandmother knowledge, or is a large data set of millions of story knowledge? Like, I don't know, it totally depends, right? So I think it really boils down to like, what do you want to get out of your experience and understand like where all this stuff comes from, because there is a reason why we're teaching it, and it comes from somewhere. So to know where that all is, and to also then question where other knowledge comes from, I think is actually a super important skill.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. And I think there's probably a lot of people listening who might be interested in this one. And it's very specific. What kind of students are you looking for? So I think here we want to talk about like what background are you looking for? Jason already said something about, orientation to children. What kind of classes do you recommend or special training? And then, are there opportunities just for graduate students or also undergrads? I'm sure we have a lot of undergrads tuning in here. It's one of the reasons we formulated the Blitz to begin with, is to get more exposure of the research to undergrads and help them understand the opportunities. So I'd like to hear from each one of you a little bit on what kinds of students, you would like to be recruiting.
I'll go.
For me, yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, and it'll be brief. I think there's various ways that things can be a little challenging when you're engaging in a, well, okay. The personal drive to personal drive and the personal confidence to go after something that no one's ever really gone after before is far and away the sort of number one thing in my mind. More practically, I think there is we do tend to build stuff. We tend to build software, and so some background in producing software, even if it's only in your personal projects, is usually required. But this what I was trying to sort of stumble over was, sometimes there's an urge to say, well, that's not really an important enough question, or that's not really something that I really do in my world. And I'd say try to shake some of that off, because once you're sort of operating at the forward edge, no one's really there. As Jason was sort of saying, there's no real experts. It all has to kind of come from somewhere. And so have that kind of confidence that, like, if it seems fuzzy and you're not really sure, you're probably on the right track, and just keep going. So I think looking for folks that can dive in even when things are ambiguous and it's not real clear, and there's no papers out there on that topic and you haven't really read anything about it. That's usually what I'm looking for.
Similar for me. I think persistence and curiosity are kind of the central things, and curiosity is kind of one way of driving that persistence. Everything else, all of the knowledge, all of the skills that you might need to have in order to get something done, they're all kind of situational. Like, it depends on what question you're asking. It's often the case that I'll recruit an undergrad and we'll be working on some problem, and we'll just discover one afternoon, oh, it turns out that you need to learn this whole branch of statistics. Okay, let's go off and learn that. Or it turns out we need to go learn this new technology to solve this problem. So we'll go learn those things. That's just what researchers end up having to do, is learn new skills, new disciplines, new literatures to be able to investigate the things that we're curious about. So I think I look for those core behaviors and traits and personality things, and not so much specific skills, because you have to learn them on the job.
Yeah, I think I would absolutely echo what Amy, and I think Jason, you said this earlier. I'm very much looking for people that are organized and committed to the work, as opposed to having some specific background or some specific set of skills. Because I think everyone here that does research on this call, if you ask them, we're constantly having to teach ourselves new things, and we're constantly having to learn new things. And a lot of us really love that and love sharing that. So as long as you have an openness and a curiosity, to me, it's a lot less important that you have a certain particular set of skills, but that you're open to new things. And my research group does qualitative, quantitative, systems design-based work. We kind of go end to end.
I think mine would be, so I had mentioned before the reason why I'm more interested, at least my specific research. Now, I'll talk about my specific first, and then maybe more broadly in general what I've seen. For me, like, I lead a group of maybe like 20 to 30 undergrads and grad students. So it's a pretty big group. And I think everyone in that group has like a real love for children and learning. And so that, to me, so I'll give you an example. Like when a student comes to me and says, like, oh, I want to do some of the research that you're doing, and they show me a resume that's all about machine learning in nutritional habits, and I'm kind of like a little bit aghast of like, what do I do with this? I don't quite know, right? It's not that the person wouldn't fit or anything like that. It's just all of a sudden, like, you have this sort of mismatch. And so part of that might be that like knowing the person that knows me, it's kind of like, I kind of want to know if they've read a paper of mine at least, or at least read the website, you know, at least said like, oh, he works with kids and family, right? As opposed to like, if there's some, you know, I don't want like, I get so much spam from like journals that say like, you should apply to the Journal of Mechanistic Engineering in agriculture. And I'm like, you have no idea who I am, do you? So, I sometimes I think undergrads or graduate students approach us in that way, and that's why we might not, because if you don't explain sometimes the match, it doesn't necessarily have to be skills. I think it is really about that curious question and some of the background leading up to that. Like sometimes I'll tell students like, you're not really quite yet ready for research, but if you would show me that like, you know, you volunteered at a Boys and Girls Club, or you have tutored, or you showed me coaching, or, you know, if you're really interested in this kids thing, then I can see it in your resume. And not, I would say like 99% of the time, anyone who doesn't have a kid's background usually then just looks at me as like they walk away, right? But then the people that really still want to stick with it, like really do, they're like, they come back a year after year and start to show me that they've kind of built up like, oh, I started doing this, I started doing that. And I was like, that's great. Why don't you come on board? And so I oftentimes look for that. I look for a lot of times as well, like, the last thing, just really good collaborators. I can't, you know, part of it is that like, I think when, I don't know if you know, my friends here will agree or not, but I think when we invite people to join our team, there's a sense of like openness we have to give, and there's a bit of trust. Like I have to like trust this student that all of a sudden I'm giving data that no one has seen before. I have to trust that person, right? So they have to work well with me. They have to be someone that I can really, you know, like there's a piece of video, or there's like this log data, or like, you know, I don't want anyone deleting things off the server that they should not be deleting, right? So there is a sense of trust that has to be built, and that takes time. I think that, I think a lot of people think that like, if I jump straight into research, I'm going to be publishing my first paper in year 1 or less. I'm like, no, sometimes like my undergrads, it takes 2 or 3 years before we can get a paper out, because I've got to train them and do other. So it's that like willingness to want to learn is really important, because you can't rush research. I think research is maybe, that's the one thing, at least about academic wise, like we go at a kind of like a slow cooker's pace sometimes, because we're thinking really hard about it, and that takes time.
All right. So the curiosity is big, but this is also serious business to all of us, right? You have to be committed, and you're in for the long haul a little bit. So, okay. So another sort of practical questions, how can students get involved or get started? And something related to that is, you know, are there paid opportunities for students? Are there ways they can just receive credit? What are the different ways that students can work with you and get started in research?
Maybe I'll get started and just explain sort of the broader program level things too, because there are actually some programmatic things as well, like our research capstone, for example. If you're an informatics major, there's 2 different types of capstones, and if you can find a faculty member like one of us that's willing to advise you on a research capstone, you can do that instead of the other capstone model. So that's sort of a more direct front door for participation. But you do still have to convince one of us to mentor you on it. So all of those same things from the previous question apply. For my lab in particular, I have a link on my faculty webpage that has an application form. And so I just accrue a huge list of students that are excited about participating. And then we use that whenever we're looking for somebody to help out with something, to help recruit. So I'll often reach out to students a few months after they've written and see if there's some opportunity. But I know all of us work quite differently. So that's my model.
I think my model would be that it kind of depends on the project. So I have like, I have my projects where I yearly take in and yearly produce like students who want to be in that. Usually starts at like, I kind of run it almost like a school in some ways, like, okay, springtime, I recruit, summertime, you come in and you work with me, by fall, you're ready to go. And then you start doing the research with me in the fall and winter and spring, and it repeats, right? That's the more sort of general research. And then there are things, and that tends to be, I'm gonna be honest, it's unpaid unless depending on like the situation, but the ones that are actually more paid opportunities, those are very specific projects. So for example, like I have a grant from the NSF that's looking for people who can speak Spanish, right? Like it's a very specific grad. Like I actually really need someone that speaks Spanish very well, like, and can go and can do these interviews. And that's going to be very different than saying someone who doesn't have it. So I might end up having to oh, well, for this grant, I wrote in an undergrad who could speak Spanish to run this project with me, right? Or I might have, I have another project where we're doing esports and wellness. And I'm like, yeah, that project's going to go work really well with a student who has done esports, right? It's not going to work well with anyone who's never played a video game. That won't be a very good, you would be a person who's worked with kids would go great with my general side of research, and I would point them in that direction. I run a directed reading research group, but very specific niche projects that I also have those too. And that's where I may have to interview students. I may actually have to specifically recruit. So you're kind of looking to see, do you fit in more a general kind of pathway? And I have students that do both. I have students who are incredibly focused on the one specific project because they are the undergrad or grad student that has that skill. I actually need that. And then I have students who are just learning, and then I just kind of take them along for on a different project. But it all kind of depends on the context and situation.
Let me maybe jump in and make a plug for and thank both Amy, Michelle, and Hala, who've been kind of instrumental in getting the research capstones available to students. I've sponsored a bunch of these. So if you're at the beginning of your program and you're just thinking about them, keep kind of your mind open to these. I think they're a great way to get some continued experience over the course of a year doing a research project and get to own certain parts of it. And let me also plug the idea for MLIS. And I think in some students, you can do independent studies with faculty. So if you want some credit for working on a research project, that's another way to get it. I'll say personally for my research group, one of the things that we do is we have this kind of wiki page in which we dump ideas that we constantly have. And then we're voting or moving some of them to the top or moving some of them down. So in the chat, I'll put a link to that page. For anyone that wants to go and look at it, there's some instructions about how, if you're interested in one of those projects, you can get in touch with us. But typically, there's kind of a vetting process. You've got to, demonstrate to our group that you're interested and willing to work on this for some time. And after we decide that, then we figure out how, what that looks like, whether it's a capstone, whether it's a paid position, or whether it's something like an independent study.
So contacting me, I think through email is probably the best way. I think some other folks on the panel here have a much more mature set of processes for engaging with students. I'm a little jealous. I'm taking notes now, but really I think the pattern that's worked for us in the past is that there tends to be some kind of a software artifact involved in most of the projects that we do on that we work with. And so getting engaged on helping to design and build those software artifacts is one way to get involved in the deeper research that's usually led by PhD students. And that might be a way to sort of get some experience with, say, some machine learning methods that you don't have, rather than sort of pushing the envelope, right when you walk in. It might be sort of helping to sort of build the software around the machine learning method, thereby get some experience with it. And we've seen that pattern work pretty well. And we've had some success with undergrads and master's students getting engaged in that way.
Great. So as you can see, there's lots of different ways to engage, some more mature than others, according to Bill. But I think the one thing is don't hesitate. You can always reach out, and there's always, to an individual faculty member, look at their website first. And I know there was also a question, what do you do if someone doesn't respond to me?
Oh, I have an answer for that.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's hear it.
Well, first off, I'm going to apologize to any students here that have already tried to do that. I've actually, I'm 2 weeks behind on my email.
Yeah, never take offense.
I've seen a couple of, I've asked about research, and I promise to get to them. If you're on here, don't be like, hey, I asked you and you didn't. I think one way, I know for a lot of times it's super busy. I think one thing to understand about faculty life is that it kind of happens in cycles. If you email me in September at my busiest, I'm just gonna oh my gosh, I might not see it, right? And I apologize. I'm normally pretty good with emails, but certain time periods, if you end up in the vortex, so sometimes it's it might be just pushing again, just hey, I emailed you a week or two ago, is it okay? Another tip that I always tell students is that email the doctoral student or the postdoc. sometimes they will be able to like knock on the door for you and say, like, one of the like I'll tell a story. Like I found one of like a great grad student simply because she went to like a friend of mine, like, you know, and it said like, oh, like, you know, so and so, I'm interested in meeting, and she's like, yeah, let's set an appointment with you, and so she was the one that made the introduction. Cold calls are tough. I have to be completely honest. Like, it's kind of like people just send me the resume and like, I want to come. I'm like, oh my God, okay, like hold on a sec. Let's talk and figure this out, right? So I think those are some tips, but definitely sometimes like getting in touch with one of our doctoral students or the postdoc, it helps a lot, or people that have worked with us, and they can sometimes make the introduction. It becomes a little easier. But I do apologize. Emails happen in seasons. And so anyone who has sent me an email in the past 2-3 weeks, it may be in the vortex. I promise I will look and fish it out again. That's my promise to you all.
And I would say something stronger. I feel like I had to learn the faculty email pattern as I was coming up, and now I doing it myself, which is, you know, it literally means nothing if you don't get a response, right? Like there's not much, certainly for speaking for myself, and I think speaking for some of you I've worked with, there's just no harm in trying again a lot of times, because as Jason said, sometimes it just kind of goes into vortex, you just didn't have time to it. So pinging again and is not going to offend anybody, or not going to really get.
Yeah, I get about 100 or 200 a day. So yeah. it's like you're, you know, it's like, go ahead and send it again. Sure, 101 tomorrow. It's fine. You know, like I think it helps out a lot.
Great. So I'm so glad you all were very convincing, and do not take offense. It means nothing personally if you don't hear back. You know, if you continually get no response, then, you know, try the other angles and maybe try someone else. But yeah, don't be defeated. So there are other questions here that I got, but I really want to open it up now. I think we're at that point where I'll come back to some of these if we have time. But I really would like to give a chance for people to now, if we can open up the chat for questions, we'll let those come in and I'll read them out, and we'll you know, hear from all of you. What's burning now that you've heard from these great, passionate researchers? What more do you want to know? They can speak about their particular interests, but also more generally about things in the school and the university. So Tim, is the chat open now for questions?
Yes, the chat is now enabled.
Okay, so don't be shy. And I also, again, as I said before, if you want to raise your hand, that's also a good way. Be great to hear from some of you.
As we're waiting people to think and type, there was a thought I had earlier with the question of you know, why get into research that we rolled through that I thought I'd spit out. But I feel like it's one of the, it's the job, it may be unique in the world, is a job where there's the potential for authenticity, I guess is the phrase I'm sort of use, right? So if you're at a company, you're, you know, at the end of the day, you're going to be trying to increase their shareholder value, and that is your job, right? So that's always going to be sort of in the background. So you might want to try to figure out the problem, or do things the right way, or do things, or really sort of study this question. And there are definitely companies that allow for some of that. But at the end of the day, you're pushing a product, you know. But here in these kinds of things, the truth of the answer is ultimately really what's supposed to only matter. There are some incentive structures and pressures and so forth on you that, you know, I can't say it's all totally pure, but there's nothing built into the system to really say, you know, that is the goal, is to try to get more straight answers out there. So I really kind of it appealed to me that there were no automatic roadblocks to being sort of authentic about trying to answer these questions.
That's inspiring, Bill. Well, we don't have any questions yet. Oh, here's one. This is great. All right, so this question is, how can I know if I am ready for research work or not? How can I know?
I started
Great
at
question.
16, if that gives you any case, like, but I was, you know, so sometimes you can, I think anyone can start. It just depends on whether you're willing to like take on the work that's available at the time. And so, you know, and I'll be completely honest, when I was 16, working in a lab, like they made me wash dishes. Like, I'm not joking. That's what I did. And I did it. Right. And I also learned how to, like, you know, clean the mice cages and do all that. And I had to do that because I think there's this sort of misconception in research, I think, for students that like, they're going to throw me in with everything all at once. And we're going to do I'm like, you know, like there's also, I don't think people understand, like I'm usually at Target at like 11 p.m. at night, looking for snacks for children. That's how I get my research done. It's not in a creepy way, but more like because I run this program for children. But I mean, stuff like that, like it has to get done. Like there are basic things, no matter what, at least in my research, like, I have to clean up the popcorn off the floor sometimes. I have to run and grab, but I also do the big giant lectures. So it's kind of like in that question about, are you ready? I'm like, yeah, if you're ready to take on certain basic tasks and then move up, for sure. We just, but I think that there is depending on how everything works out.
And
I'm not going to make
semester
you
for
clean
me,
class, by the way.
right? Like I was just the freshman. I was 18. I mean, I knew how to program a little bit, and that was about it. So the reason that the professor took a bet on me was just because I expressed interest and motivation, and those are the kind of key essential ingredients. As we said before, virtually everything that you need to know to do research depends on the research you're doing. And so you can't be prepared for that. That's sort of the definition of what research is.
Okay, here's a very specific question for Bill and Jason. Do you also have lab research pages or lists?
Oh yeah, I'll put that up.
Okay, so if you do, go ahead and put it in the chat. And if not, I would say just send them an email and be persistent. Okay. In general, are there more expectations for graduate students assisting in iSchool research versus undergraduates? Second part of that is, what have those responsibilities looked like? So expectations, responsibilities.
Let's start off by differentiating between different types of grad students. So a master's student helping out on a research project versus an undergraduate, they may have really similar kinds of contributions because they may not be working full time on research. They may be doing it while they're also in classes, for example. But a PhD student, right, has very different responsibilities. They're developing their own research trajectory. They're developing expertise in an area. So there's a lot of different learning that they're doing over the course of many years. And so it's a really different kind of engagement with research, one that's very central as opposed to something that might be peripheral on top of coursework.
I would say depend, kind of like similar, Amy, depends. Like when I was a graduate first year PhD student at the University of Maryland, I remember, I think I'm telling you my story, like I was a teacher for 6 years. So I stopped research for 6 years here. Like, from undergrad, I was doing it, but then, I had a hard stop from like the moment I graduated from my master's program, and then when I was working. And so when I got back into it, like I had to learn all the same. And there were some people there's some undergrads that were probably more advanced than I was at the time. So kind of totally depends on the situation where people were in life. I will say that my first year master's students who have never done research are about the same level as my first year undergraduate students who've never done research. So it's not, I don't think age, there might be some experience things like, oh, if all of a sudden, like, let's say this master's student knows how to like build a user interface for children, or they've done UX, then there's a little bit difference. But if people are coming to me right off the bat, let's say they're just, the only differentiation is the number of years of school, then I kind of expect the same. Sometimes I might expect the same things. I've also had undergrads like, lead papers before, but that was after like 3 or 4 years of working in my lab. So it totally depends on the person, like but in general, I just kind of look at everyone who starts and I'm like, okay, you're here, all right, you compare to like how others have been, this is probably how you'll be in my lab right now, and then we'll see how it goes in this case.
Okay, this is a really great question coming up here. I know you guys can all see these in the chat too. So, and I think I would love to hear from everyone on this one, because I think that you'll have different thoughts. How have your research questions or interests changed over time? How did you initially establish your interests and then narrow them down?
Oh no, are you on my review committee? that's a very hard question.
Yeah, so it might take a little thinking, but yeah, how have your interests changed over time? It's a great thing to reflect on.
I mentioned a little bit earlier on that I had started off with wanting to make sure that we built something that helped somebody, which is not always true of all research. There's sort of a basic research that we sort of devoid of applications, and I wanted to keep that thread towards applications. And then it was about, oh, we're going to save science by sort of improving that machine for across all disciplines. And that was a bit big, and we gave some help in some ways. But I honestly, I think my trajectory has been sort of getting more and more relevant to things that more and more people care about. So it started off with if you're helping oceanographers, there's only a set of oceanographers that end up kind of caring at the end of the day. And I kind of wanted to make sure that I was working on problems that I could talk to, somebody's grandmother about and have them sort of understand the connection to. And I think the information school has that character about it. So there's a lot of work right now, folks mentioned elections and misinformation and so on. So always trying to keep that thread there. So that's one way I try to do the litmus test of whether this is a good problem or not. Certainly not the only test, but it's one of the boxes that needs to be checked before you engage in a project. Is it going to be relevant to enough people to be worthy of sort of time and energy and money?
Yeah, I would sort of echo some of what Bill said. I think a lot of traditional information science has thought of the expert users being scientists and people doing empirical research. Over time, I think a lot of things like end user programming, things like the sort of affordances that are built into systems, the scope has broadened much more to consider a kind of more general set of users and populations. So as that trend has taken hold in information science, I think I've hopefully been at the forefront of that, not following, but my interests have very much wandered that direction, moving from, say, open data use in scientific research to open data that is enabling applications and technologies in cities.
I think my phenomenon has been pretty stable in that I've been interested in programming, but the aspect of it that I've looked at has really shifted pretty dramatically. It used to be that I thought a lot about tools and what people were using to create software. And that just shifted more towards what was going on in people's minds as they were creating software, to how do we change their minds over time through learning and teaching. So really kind of just moving around that same phenomena, but kind of looking at the same thing, just with different lenses each way.
For me, it's very similar to Amy. Like the question of families and collaborative technologies hasn't changed. It's broad enough. It's a big tent that I can sort of cover a lot. I think what has changed, and I always sort of say this, and like when faculty or collaborators ask me out for coffee, I get very nervous. I'm like, oh no, because there's going to be some project that comes out of this coffee and like, we're going to be doing something together. And somehow I'll have coffee with like John Froelich in the CSE department. All of a sudden he's like, Jason, I want to use kids team in like my MHCID course. And I'll like, yeah, let's do that. It's a great idea. Let's go into the direction of HCI education. Right. Or I'll have coffee with another friend and then she, I'll ask her, wait a second, have you ever studied, children searching the internet when you look at like immigrant populations? And she'll say no. And I'm like, great, we're going to go in this direction. So a lot of that directional shift and change has just been, and I'm not joking, it's actually just been over a couple calls. That's kind of why I miss I'm like, oh, I miss the hallway talk and everything like that. It's that sort of facilitation space. Sometimes these things, they emerge because we talk to each other and we sort of like are within our fields, and then we're also within the iSchool and then other collaborators within our community. And so a lot of my research evolves based on people's own interests and their different expertise. And I'm like, yeah, that would be great if I could latch onto your stuff, because you've got a great way of doing things that I never thought about. It would be so wonderful. So that's how my mind evolves quite a bit.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you brought up the collaborations and the synergies, and the things that attract your attention are often, the things that are complementary, but not dead center of what you already do. So yeah, lots of dynamics there. Okay, ready for the next one? All right, this is longer, so I'll see if I can get it right. Do you frequently collaborate with each other, or do you generally conduct research within your group? Is there collaboration across other disciplines? I would expect some in sociology areas, but are there any biological collaborations? So yeah, frequency of collaboration across disciplines, maybe some examples of the ways that the disciplinary reach you have with your research.
I'm going to guess that collectively the answer is yes to all of those questions. I certainly collaborate. Yeah, I certainly collaborate with others, even on this panel. Like I've written with Jason before, and Bill and I are talking about future collaborations. I collaborate with people in other disciplines on this campus and at other universities, including psychology and education and learning sciences and computer science. No biological collaborations for me, but others do.
My closest biological collaboration would be public health in that sort of way. I've worked with public health in the University of Southern California, or environmental science. I've worked with folks like Dargan Frierson at Earth Games. I've worked with him before. So, I mean, I think that there's I think that's kind of why I like the iSchool. I chose an iSchool over an education school because I wanted to go to lunches with colleagues that did very different things than I did. I just thought, like, you know what, when you go to an ed school, not to knock ed schools, I came from one, but a lot of the things are like, oh, education policy, education testing, statistics, measurement, like psychological, I was kind of used to it, but I was like, I kind of want to learn something brand new that's completely different from what I do. So when I had the choice of either going to an ed school and iSchool, I picked an iSchool because I'm like, yeah, I can talk to like any three of these folks and just have a conversation and figure out, like, yeah, like tomorrow we can have a project, although I'm overloaded, so don't ask me. But I will say that, like, yeah, I've worked very closely. I'll just say personally, my collaborators tend to be like, I've worked with Amy on some papers before on computing and education. I worked very closely with Jinha Lee at the Gamer Lab. I worked very closely with Alexis Hienecker with her work on like dark patterns in children, very closely with Julie Keynes as well in human-centered design and engineering. Carmen Gonzalez at the University of Washington Communication School, and other collaborators just across the country at the University of California, Irvine, and Maryland, and just other places. So, it's kind of a fun job, just because I always sort of say, like, when I go to conferences, it always feels like a reunion of sorts. That's why I was sort of sad this year when we didn't have COVID kind of bringing everything down, because I get the chance to see my friends for like year. Like, it's kind of neat. Like, I've had friends for like, I think 15 years now, since like grad school and everything, that I still see at conferences and are like, oh, cool. Like, how's life after grad school? Like, how's your kids? Oh, like, what kind of collaborate, so it is kind of neat to kind of see them year after year at a conference. Like and during those conferences, I meet new people and I find other collaboration and so that's kind of how they get built up in my world.
Yeah, I don't think a lot more to add. I would say, yes, we collaborate across the iSchool. I don't personally have any links to bio. I'm sure Bill does. I know that Jevin West came from the bio department at the University of Washington, so he has very strong roots there. So if you can contact one of us, we can put you in touch with him, or you can contact him directly.
I'll just mention there's a place on campus called the eScience Institute that I was nominally leading for a while, where we tried to centralize some of the interesting data science work that was going on, with the explicit goal of saying, well, look, a lot of this stuff is interdisciplinary. And, if you get, we had these nice little anecdotes where it was like, astronomers were, on the whiteboard talking about image processing, pointing things up, and microscopy people would walk by and say, oh, actually we use this other technique, but they point the things down, at the very small. And so there's this cross collaboration. So we drank that Kool-Aid quite a bit. And through that connection, there's, I've had, as Nick mentioned, there's been various collaborations with people all across campus, but that place still exists, even though I'm not running it anymore. And that's a great place to go if you want to find ways to connect the iSchool with what's going on elsewhere on campus and some of these data-oriented work.
Amy and I are at DUB, Design, Use, Build. So we work with that group at HCI through computer science, HCDE, design, iSchool. And I didn't realize some biological sciences do, or health sciences do, like HCI. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize that. So I'll put other fun people in that bucket.
I think there's about 9 or 10 different units that have HCI
Yeah.
faculty in them now. So
The eScience Institute stole a lot of ideas from Dub about how to actually build a cross-campus collaborative entity. So that's yeah, we're getting pretty good at this at UW, I think.
I mean, this is an important point to just point out that research isn't a very structured thing. We have questions, we find experts that are around us to help us do the work that we need to do. And sometimes they're in our school, sometimes they're in our campus, sometimes we have to go to other universities to find them. Sometimes we do things with people in industry as part of that too. So it's much more like entrepreneurship than anything else. You put together the team that you need to answer the question. And it's much less rigid around exactly who's participating in that.
Okay. Next question. Coming from a very different background to iSchool, can we still contribute to research without relevant experience or background?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, I came from an ed school, which is different than an iSchool.
My background was in CS and psychology. I knew nothing about information schools when I started as faculty here. So you can even get hired as faculty not knowing.
Oh my God, you can teach
information.
iSchool classes having never taken an iSchool class. So
That's right.
that's me.
Yeah, I think there's a strong yes to that, and it's more about sensibilities and passion and direction and wanting to learn and be curious. I think we heard that uniformly. So please take that to heart, all of you. I think it's very, very genuine that people will take you very seriously if you come to them and are interested in what they're doing, and that you can develop what you need to learn, oftentimes with the person who you're working with. Okay, Bill's put some links in here. Okay, next question. In the context of applying research as an undergrad, do professors generally prefer recruiting lower classmen undergrad so they have more time to establish trust with those students? So there, yeah, we had that theme of trust earlier. So does that demonstrate a preference for newer undergrads or junior, those incoming?
I don't
Maybe-
particularly have a preference. Like I've had senior undergrads who start. Now I will say that it is a little bit more easier to work with underclassmen that like maybe who might be freshmen and sophomores that I have been able to like train up for the next 4 years, but because seniors, but you know, I mean, even 1 year of research I think is really helpful, even if you don't necessarily like go through my entire like 3-4 years with me, simply because I think you'll just learn a lot in 1 year, and that can make a big difference wherever you head out in the world, whether you become a researcher or not. I think those skill sets or those understandings are still really important.
There's a way of flipping around this question too, and saying that if you are interested in a career in research and getting a PhD, for example, earlier is better so that you have time to learn about what research is. And by the time you get to your autumn year of your 4th year of school, if you're applying to a PhD program, if you're starting research, then you don't have much to say about what you know about research. So starting earlier than that can be really helpful. But like Jason, like if I'm hiring somebody for their skills to help out on a project, it doesn't really matter who they are or what their position is, as long as they have those skills. If I'm hiring somebody to mentor them for several years so that I can help them get to graduate school and a PhD, more time is better.
I think like a lot of the answers were probably all giving context matters, right? So it depends on the project, depends on the person. But I don't think there's any kind of blanket statement about earlier in your undergraduate career being better than later. It really just depends on what you want to do and what you want to get out of the experience.
I guess just to provide a counter answer to that, maybe I do think that sometimes undergrads may underestimate the draws on their time when they engage, you know, like for certain quarters, maybe taking sort of 2 classes and think, oh yeah, I've got plenty of time to sort of engage in this. And sometimes they sort of learn that. And I think kind of learning about yourself and your work patterns and what you can take on may develop a little bit over the first couple of years. but I would actually agree with everybody else that there's usually that's not a very strong signal. I don't really have a obvious preference for upper, more senior students versus less senior students. It just sort of depends.
Well, that's a great segue into this next question.
Excellent.
I think you'll all like this one a lot. How do you manage your time between all the research projects you work on? Looking at some of the links sent above, there seems to be a lot of research that goes on concurrently with each other. Do you have a research project that you are more focused or concentrated on? But isn't this the million-dollar question of managing all the different projects at different points in their trajectory? How do you do that?
I think we're all shaking our heads because we're wondering, what do we manage it? I'm not sure. We have different levels of management. I am very obsessive about managing my time. So I'll post a link here. So if you're curious, this is on my website. So I use this to kind of keep track of when I can say yes to things.
Don't be intimidated.
Really
I've seen this before. Do not be intimidated by it.
Don't click that
Because
link.
it intimidates me all the time when I see this.
So these are all the things I've said yes to. And I don't have any time until, like, I don't know. I guess you have to go to March 2022. So yeah. So we juggle. We just balance our commitments. We do lots of different things and we try not to overcommit, and we usually fail at that. And we're just too interested, I think, sometimes.
I do think, the only way to work effectively on multiple projects is through students, right? You're not going to, individual people aren't going to dive in really deeply on 5 different projects. And despite the fact that sometimes you try, you have sort of, having had a soft money research position in the past, that was sometimes the game was to try to do this, but it's not very effective. The other thing maybe I'll share, I guess, is I've had a colleague that would talk about, you have your one main one that occupies 50-60% of your time, and then you have something that's kind of you're cooking up that's a little bit early that you're spending maybe 30% of your time on, and then the last 10% is on maybe something that's further out down the road that you're really just having coffee conversations about, and that trying to keep that balance. So if you have like 3 main things you're working on, that's probably not very effective. If you have 0 main things you're working on, then you probably made some other mistake along the way. But trying to keep that sort of balance of one going on, one in the hopper, and then one that's a little bit further afield. I thought that was seemed reasonably.
But I think we have to contextualize all of this too and say, like, you're talking to a bunch of faculty that have many years of practicing doing more and more every year too. Like when I was an undergrad as a freshman, I only had 1 project. I had 1 project at a time for like 3 years before I figured out how to have 2. And then as a graduate student, I figured out how to have 2 or 3, and really mostly just 1, but sometimes 2 or 3. And then it was really only once I was faculty that I had to figure out how to manage lots of things all in parallel. So it's not like you do that all at once.
I like to use food. If you ever talk to me and hang out with me, I use food analogies quite a bit. So I'm going to use one here. I feel like at this point in my life, I'm sort of the, what Amy had said before, it's almost like entrepreneurship. I feel like I'm a restaurateur at this point. When I was an undergrad, I was probably like a dishwasher, like line cook at best, right? I worked in a small, tiny restaurant, and then at some point I started learning how to be maybe a sous chef. And then I started learning how to be maybe, a pastry chef. And then all of a sudden, maybe like now I could actually be the head chef, but it was still one project, right? Like, and then all of a sudden, like as I became a chef, I started learning more, and I started realizing, you know what, I can talk to the farmer and source my materials. I can do accounts payable. And then you start adding on, and all of a sudden, like, you start to say, like, I don't have to have 1 restaurant. I could own 2 restaurants, right? I could have 2 projects, right? I could do 3 projects. Oh, maybe there's 3 restaurants in here, right? Like a sushi place, an Italian place, and a sushi Italian fusion place, right? Like I could do both, right? And then all of a sudden you start to realize at some point, like, at least for me, like, I might have to hire a business manager to run certain things. I might have to do so. There becomes this point where the restaurateur does very different things than what the line cook would do. Although I'm not going to say that I don't still do line cooking. Like I still, and I will stress this, I still clean up after children. They leave things on the ground and I do not leave a mess in my like lab. I tell myself like, I'm going to vacuum this thing, and I do it. Right. So there are moments where I will go back from restaurateur all the way back down to like vacuuming floors and like, what is it? I made like 60 or 70 care package like things to deliver to COVID, right? I had to deliver donuts to 8 kids in Seattle, right? So there are moments where I do the line cooking, and there are times where, you know what, I have to write this grant. I have to put, someone else has to do this part of the restaurant business. I've got to go up right now and, like, you know, talk to the program officer and ask for the funds, right? And then other times I have to mark, you know, so there's a very fast switching, at least when you get to, but like I don't expect my undergrads and graduate students even my doctoral students can barely, they're just like, oh my gosh, I'm just trying to learn how to like prepare a meal at this point, like make my own new recipe, you know? So, and they'll learn, they're all getting there in this case, but it's what Amy says. It just takes years of being able to like jump back and forth and all that.
All right, Nick, anything to add to that?
Firm commitment to your calendar and making sure that things are within reason. I know where I'm supposed to be, and you know, people emailing me or slacking me and telling me where I'm supposed to be.
Oh yeah, I have multiple monitors. I'm looking at 3 monitors right now. That helps a lot. More efficiency. Don't use small.
All right, now you are frightening our listeners. But I will say, I often, when I first start talking to students coming to research, it's the first thing I tell them. You have to learn that layering of projects and you know, how to manage that. But it's also exciting. It's exciting to have things just starting and things that are closing up that you can really point to as great accomplishments. So it's part of the rewards as well. Okay, we're getting close to the end of the hour. I saved this one question. Oh, I don't know. I don't think I can pass this one up. We got one more question, although I think Ian's had more than one. We'll take this.
Jason's class.
How should you approach and read a research paper? When reading a research paper, what is the appropriate method to ask for help and clarification if you don't understand something? I think this is
the appropriate method is ask for help and clarification. We just talk to each other a lot, right?
I don't read papers like top to bottom. I read them in pieces. So I read the abstract first, then I'll read the conclusion to sort of see, like, does the conclusion make any sense? Sometimes I'm just interested in the methods, so I just go straight to the methods. I kind of jump around a lot, and then once I sort of jump around, if I really feel like I want to read the whole paper, then I'll read it from top to bottom. But I tend to just kind of look at it in chunks and pieces before I make the final judgment of whether this research paper. And so I think that trick has worked out pretty well. And be able to glance, and you start to get pretty good at it once you start, like, oh yeah, I can read Nature. I sort of get what's going on here. Okay, they put this funny graph here for some reason. I know this. I know what he's trying to do here. You know, so you just practice a lot of like jumping back and forth. At least that was my technique.
Yeah, I agree. Strategic reading, lots of practice. And, you know, I could point you to my email where I'm talking to Shirag just this afternoon, asking him questions. So, you know, it never stops asking for help, just like it never stops having to teach ourselves other things.
Sometimes I email the author. What did you mean by this?
Yeah.
I don't understand why you wrote this.
We are bold like that. Okay, we are coming to a close. These were fabulous questions. I think I'm liking this format. We might want to think about Blitz of some combination. Does the author ever respond is the question. Yes, they do, right? Sometimes they'll ignore you, but mostly they really like to engage. So that's good. Okay, I'm going to ask this question, but we're not going to answer it because I saved this one. And I guess we'll just close with the question I was going to ask is, what do you wish students would ask about research? So I think we've gotten a lot of great questions. I don't know if there's anything there you want to blurt out as a closer, what you wish people would ask. But I thought we had a great run of questions. Any wishes?
I have one, but
Pick up on the last thing that we talked about. I think the first start into research is figuring out what other people have done. And so reading the literature, understanding kind of what has been asked and answered before is one of the things that always makes me really impressed by someone when they come and talk to me.
Okay, Jason, 2 sentences.
I wish people asked, like, where does research take us from, like, the most basic things of our existence to all the way to the future? Like, someone once said, like, you know, if you think about a pencil, right, the most basic tool we've ever developed, You know, the pencil has like wood, it's lead, it's got paint. All research went into that, right? How do you build the pencil? How do you structure it? How do you like, what's the right paint to use? How did we know an eraser could work? How do we, you know, and R&D went into all that, even the materials, right? Like all of a sudden, so you could trace it all. So it's almost kind of like, I wish people would think about research not as this project, but actually a way to think about the world beyond just projects.
Okay, that was his 2 sentences. So
Sorry.
That's all right. No, we're right
Pencil. That's it.
on the money. Pencil, right. Take that away with you. I just want to say a couple of words to reinforce sort of, you know, where you can find research opportunities now that you've heard all of this wisdom about research. Don't forget about the research capstones we've talked about, iCareers, people will post their research assistantships there. There's research seminars. Anything else people want to plug? Go to people's web pages. People will post positions.
Talk to our doctoral students. They'll tell you honestly what they think about us, which is scary, but you can talk to them.
Yep.
All of the
So-
above, which just means being resourceful and really persisting.
All right. Well, I really want to thank everybody. We're right at 4 o'clock. We'll call the Blitz to a close. And I really, really appreciate everyone who came and listened and participated and asked questions. And again, our panelists, thank you for doing this online with us. It's a really important part of getting oriented to the school. So farewell. And I hope you're going to love your first week of classes starting tomorrow, right?
Starting tomorrow.
I'm not prepared. That's why the balance is not right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Carol.
Thanks,
Hi,
Carol.
Carol.
Thanks, Carol.